Hey everybody, how you guys doing? We're looking at our second video on the Renaissance here, looking at the idea of humanism and Christian humanism today. This is a huge topic for the Renaissance and a huge change in the thought process in Europe, going from the 14th through almost the 17th centuries, right? So 1300s all the way through the 1600s. Here are three big things we have to be able to figure out by the time we're done with this, all right? Hint, hint. These are the things that, we'll talk about, test on, all that, okay? Number one, big terms we got to know. Humanism, virtue, right? Like that. Civic humanism, Christian humanism. What's the difference here, okay, in these different thought processes of this time? How are these a change in thought from the previous age? So what are we challenging a little bit with this thought process in European history? And lastly, how are some of these writers viewed by different people everywhere? Okay, those are big things we got to know by the time we're done. Let's do this. All right. So number one is humanism. What is this whole thing, right? So as part of the Renaissance, we see this big revival of Greek and Roman thought, getting away from the church and being the only thing we know about, and getting more into some question about what kind of things can people do. It's not just about, the church doing cool things and God doing cool things, but also what can people do, right? And so one big topic here will be the idea of individualism, okay? That people as individuals have great potential to do good stuff, okay? We're talking about this topic of virtue, right? Which essentially is the ability for us to do great things and that humans can do good stuff. We're going to see questions of reason, thought processes. So basically, how do we think through stuff and how do we change our thought process and how do we decide what's going on, what's happening? And the idea also of nature, kind of how does nature play a role in our lives? We see Greek and Latin becoming languages that are studied again and being translated, kind of checking some translations of the Bible, other things that happen, other documents that are there. And we're going to start questioning some of these views that have been accepted by the church. So Aristotle's viewpoint of a lot of stuff is what's been used for a long, long time. Now instead we're looking at Plato as a Greek philosopher and Livy and Cicero as great Roman philosophers and kind of bring those in. It kind of leads to the modern day study of liberal arts. So have you ever heard liberal arts degrees or liberal arts schools? The study of literature and of art and of music, history, kind of we see the first study of this becoming very, very important. And one viewpoint of this is the idea of civic humanism. The idea that we're going to educate our rich young men, no women, we'll get to that in a second, okay? And prepare them for government leadership. So essentially, we got to have educated rulers, not just rulers because you were born to the right person, but educate rulers, teach them how to do things, teach them how to think, and make them so they're the best rulers that they can be. Also, we're going to see less and less things here decided on a base of religion. And so we're going to see a secularism being another big part of this idea of humanism. So we're going to go through a whole bunch of humanist writers here, kind of going through history from the 1300s to the 1600s, and then jump up north to the humanists, right? And so know a few of these and know what their big ideas were. We're going to start with a guy named Francisco Petrarch. Here he's shown wearing the laurels of Rome, all that kind of stuff, who was kind of our first ever modern writer. It was the first really used textual analysis. Essentially read through the old religious texts in Latin and be like, what's going on here? What does this actually mean? He was also one of the first ever professional full-time writers. Most people wrote for fun, but he actually wrote for the sake of writing. He wrote secular poetry in the Italian vernacular. Vernacular is going to be a big term here. Vernacular basically means writing in the language of the people. Before this, our educational language was all Latin. And if you could not speak Latin, you couldn't read anything. People didn't write anything important in the language that people spoke, but he wrote in Italian instead, the language of the people. And so he starts, making lyrical poetry. He travels around Europe for fun, not for business, and writes about a lot of things he sees and questions a lot of things he sees. He reads a lot of Cicero, reads a lot of Livy, and kind of brings those texts, kind of publishes those texts forward. He writes a lot of his stuff in letters, almost like letters he writes to fake people. Not fake, but like the historical figures. He writes a letter to Cicero, writes a letter to Livy, asks them questions, discusses the documents that they wrote, and also writes letters to his fellow humanists as well that are his contemporaries, especially a guy named Giovanni Boccaccio, this dude right here. And so he was friends with Petrarch. They wrote letters back and forth. We already read a little bit of Boccaccio. We read a little bit of his Decameron. which is 100 tales of Italian social commentary of 7 men and 3 women about all the human behavior that's out there. Okay, essentially sociology. Think about it. It kind of studies what human behavior does and why people do what they do, why they do things sexually, why they do things economically, why they make choices, and starts kind of studying human side of behavior. Once again, it's very secular, not what religion says we should do, but what people are actually doing, what they think about what they actually do. We have Bruni, who's one of our first who actually uses humanism as one of the terms out there. He was a member of the Florentine, and he actually writes a history of Florence using primary sources. In a way, one of our first ever modern historians. It kind of like records what was actually happening in the world at this time, and uses the actual sources and is going through texts and not just kind of sharing the stories that have been told, but actually reading through the documents and creating the story of a city. We have Vala. I love his hat. Vala is a really cool guy in that he was one of these textual analysis people that actually went through and tried to figure out if what the church had written was true or false. And so he was an expert in the Latin language, and he went back through the Latin church documents and found that, number one, the donation of Constantine was a fraud. People have said that Constantine, the great Roman emperor, had donated Rome to the church, all that kind of stuff, and basically didn't say that, right? Church said that Constantine gave him all this land, and it wasn't actually written that way. He actually also read through the Bible and found errors in the Latin Bible, that there are things that did not sound right, or did not translate right. And he was a very strict Catholic throughout the whole time. He was secretary to Pope Nicholas V, and he was not like anti-religion, but he was like, let's read through our religious books here and make sure we're getting things right versus just kind of believing what we've been told the whole time. We also have Marsilio Ficino, who founded the Platonic Academy in Florence. And so he was a very influential humanist, that he founded one of the first humanist, like liberal arts schools this time. And before this, colleges were pretty much based around religion. And he translated Plato's work and was one of the first people to make it so that we could read Plato. He translated Plato from Greek to Latin. Before this, we thought the entire document had been lost in the Middle Ages. And now we kind of take a step back from Aristotle, who was a student of Plato's, and we start looking at the philosophical ideas of Plato versus just Aristotle. And so now we start looking at more of these more traditional philosophers and thinkers than just the ones the church had already accepted. And he founds a whole academy around this. And one guy who was in this academy was a guy named Pico della Mirandola, who wrote a document we're going to read called The Oration of Dignity of Man. It was part of a book of 900 theses he wrote, essentially challenging Christianity and essentially challenging what had been taught of the church so far. And at this point, the church basically taught that we are horrible people and that God keeps us alive and that we live good lives and repent and not sin, we're going to go to heaven, right? If we don't, we're going to go to hell. And he wrote basically about the potential of humans and that human beings, people that we are, have the ability to do good things. We're created by God, who's a perfect being in the Catholic Church, right? And because we have potential to be really good people as well. But we also have free will. We could choose a name, of course, we want to, and that is kind of outside God's control. He wanted to defend all these theses that he wrote. And his book, The 900 Theses, was the first ever book banned by the Catholic Church because it challenged many of the teachings that have been going on here about people and why people act the way they do and how people are. And so you see, kind of see this general trend here of what these writers are all kind of writing about. We're going to read more of these in class, I promise you. There's this guy named Castiglione here, Baldassare Castiglione, who wrote the Courtier. My Italian is terrible, I apologize in advance here, basically of how you are a true gentleman. At this point, if you are a noble, the nobles of the old day were those who were there to kick tail and take names and wear armor and fight with swords and bash skulls in. And he's like, hold up, you cannot be a gentleman, right? A member of a court of a prince and be this, hairy, gross, spitting, whatever kind of person. Basically said, if you want to be a gentleman, you have to live to a certain type of decorum. No spitting, no nose swiping. You have to be well educated in the classics like Latin and Greek texts. You have to be a warrior who can fight and handle a sword. You have to be a dancer who can dance. You have to be able to play music. You have to be confident about yourself, but also not cocky, and be good at very, very many things. Kind of this idea of what is called a modern day Renaissance man, a person who is good at many things, but not just one thing, right? And so as a courtier, right, a member of the court of these princes and the rulers, kind of going a little bit back to Machiavelli here, as you guys saw in your previous video we talked about in class, you have to have this idea of virtue, of this ability to do good things, and can think through situations and be educated and be this true Renaissance man. The old day nobles of wearing armor and kicking butt on the battlefield are not totally done, but you can't just be that anymore. You have to be a ruler. Kind of the idea that civic humanism, be educated and be a thoughtful person. Now, one of the cool inventions that are going to change these writers is the idea of the printing press. Now, movable face type print had been invented in China a long time before this, but had not gotten to Europe yet. And Johannes Gutenberg, a printmaker, goldsmith, coppersmith, artisan in Mainz, Germany, helped to invent what's now considered to be the first, a European movable type print. Here's the example of his first printing press. You can visit the shop in Germany, I guess. It helps print one of the first Bibles. Before this, all the books we had were hand copied, right, by monks in manuscripts. I mean, these are so rare, they would chain books to the wall in libraries because people were afraid of stealing. They were worth so much money. Even the first printed books were worth a lot of money, but you could reprint them faster and faster and faster, leading to the spread of knowledge and spread of written work. And so you did this by lining up all these little texts, these little metal letters on a page. You'd ink it, press it on the page, and redo it. I mean, he had a shop of 25, 30 people probably working on this. What's so about Mr. Gutenberg, you think this guy would get loaded as part of this whole deal. A guy named Stephen Fust, who was a financier, right guy, helped invest in Gutenberg's printing press. He loaned him it was like 1,000 guilders. I think he loaned him. A guilder was a gold coin of the Netherlands. And partner up with them. They get their printing press when they're printing these Bibles, making money off this stuff, right? Today, a Gutenberg Bible goes for millions upon millions of dollars. I've gotten to see one at a college. It was amazing. You had to wear little white gloves, all that kind of stuff. But you can see how he printed it here. It's 2 columns. There are different versions of Gutenberg Bible. Some are 36 lines, some are 42 lines. They have these really cool letters on them. Some are printed on paper, some are printed on vellum, which is calfskin. Certain ones are more valuable. Anyway, long story short, Gutenberg doesn't get rich because he is sued by his partner for the money back. And basically wants double his money back, bankrupts poor Gutenberg. We think Gutenberg gets to keep a little shop, keeps printing, but his technology gets spread all over Europe, right? And you can see a little picture here. Here's cities with printing in 1450. Here's one. By 1500, here's all cities with an operating printing press that are printing both legal documents, that are printing church documents, printing Bibles, and in some cases, printing secular books. Now, a Gutenberg Bible back then cost 30 florins, florin being the gold coin of the city of Florence. That was 3 years' salary for middle-class clerks. So these are still very, very expensive items and very rare items, but they do exist at this time. Now, we're going to slide north here. And you guys know from your last video, we see the Renaissance move from the south in Italy up to the north through England, much like the plague did, right? And so things kind of tend to move south to north at this point. The Northern Renaissance doesn't really start around 1450, but most countries have their own Renaissance, right? You see Spain and Poland, Germany, France, and the very last one was Britain. But we see the big change here in government thought, art, literature, all those ideas. We'll get the art later on in class, I promise, okay? We're going to go through a few people how this is a little different. Now, what's different here, and we're going to throw a couple of quotes up here from a man named Desiderius Erasmus, who writes about the church mostly, right? So he'll leave the quotes real quick. The entire world is my temple. I verify one, two. If I'm not mistaken, I'll never lack priests to serve as long as there are men. And man's mind is so formed that it is far more simple to falsehood than to the truth. Here's this book called Praise of Folly, essentially talking about how corrupt the church is. He literally called out the church. And one of the things we'll see about Christian humanism is that they want to try and improve society and reform the church. They don't necessarily focus themselves so much on the ancient Greek and text for Rome. They're in for funsies, but not work, okay? They really want to focus on fixing the church and making sure the church is getting things right. They actually grabbed the old pre-Latin church Bibles, right? Hebrew and Greek texts, and like, hold up, did the Catholic Church get this right? As they translate it from Hebrew to Greek to Latin, are they getting things right? And these guys will actually inspire the Reformation we talk about in our next unit that's happening here. These guys walk so that the reformers and the Reformation writers like Luther and those guys can run in a few years after this. And so here's Erasmus, and we saw I have a picture up here. I apologize if I will see a picture later on of this dude, who's a Greek language expert, right? And basically, he finds a Greek New Testament, and translates it into Latin and makes sure they get it right. And he was also a guy who basically lived by writing, and writes this book, mind you, in Latin, right? As a way to try and reform the church. He basically criticized the immorality and hypocrisy of the church. He calls out the priests and the monks who are fathering children out of wedlock, who are lying to the people, right? They may not know Latin, they're educated themselves, not know Latin very well, and they're basically teaching random stuff and saying random stuff in mass, and basically calls out the immorality and hypocrisy of the church, and later will inspire those calls for reform. This was pretty controversial right at the time. Very, very controversial, because he's literally calling out the biggest institution in Europe at this point. And it's kind of dangerous for him to do. But he's a very devout Catholic, right? He's not here to destroy the church and get rid of it. He's like, dudes, my dudes and dudesses, let's get this right. Let's not destroy a thing. We'll read some Erasmus later on. In England, you have Sir Thomas More, who was actually a friend of Erasmus, who was more of a civic-minded person, also he wrote a lot of letters trying to get answered by other humanists and that kind of stuff. And he had a tough decision to make. Does he follow the rulers he worked for, or does he say what he thinks he means, right? He rose to a very high government position. He was like the top person in the court of King Henry VIII, but later was executed when he thought that Henry was doing stuff wrong and refused to agree with him. And one of the books he writes is called Utopia. He essentially says it's a kind of a fiction book, but it's also satire, right? A lot of the work we see here in Northern Humanism is satirical in basis, in that they're basically satirizing, writing these books to make fun of the church or make fun of current governments, but they want to use that not just be funny, but also make change. And so I think of The Daily Show and some of the late night TV shows that I grew up watching that were there to make fun of the government and make fun of current news, but also try to inspire change to a degree, is what they were trying to do. And he was a huge member of civic humanism, trying to get religion right. And essentially, he created this book called Utopia, where there's an island where everyone lives in perfect harmony. There's no fighting, no arguing, all that kind of stuff. And he said there are very, very basic, simple, well-written rules that everyone can understand, and that the biggest change is that there's no rich or poor. Everyone shares property equally. Nobody owns anything. Kind of very much proto-communism kind of thing Karl Marx will break out in the 1800s. He also has a world where both men and women are educated. At this point, women do not get education at all, pretty much. Very, very rarely women get education. We'll talk about it a little later on, too. And there's religious talents for everybody except atheists, who are allowed to live but are despised. Anyway, he also have things like euthanasia for sick people. All this kind of stuff is in this perfect world, right? Essentially making fun of the way the Catholic Church has been working with the monasteries, making fun of some of the types of governments that exist with rich and poor, and essentially saying we have a better world if we start doing things a little bit differently. Once again, gets beheaded, mostly because he doesn't follow Henry VIII's Reformation ideas, which we'll pick up next unit, okay? We have De Table, who's a French writer, right, who goes through and writes 5 different, Psalms, versions of Psalms of the Bible, and tries to figure out which one is the best one. And definitely does kind of what Erasmus did and check the early version of church writings with the current writings for accuracy, and challenges parts of the Bible. He was actually condemned for heresy, even though he was a very devout Catholic. He was condemned for heresy because he was actually challenging the current structure and current talk of the church. And so he was really a very devout Catholic and a very devout religious man. But because he challenged what the church was putting out there, he got in trouble and was actually condemned for heresy. You have Francisco Ximenes de Cisneros, and I apologize for interpretations that I may have gotten some translation wrong here, but he also wanted to reform the clergy in Spain and basically make it so that it was less for himself, more for the church. You didn't want to see priests and bishops and monks getting rich and owning lots of land, all that kind of stuff. And we don't see his many things in the church and during Reformation, because he was trying to make things a little different. He was also a Grand Inquisitor during the era of the Inquisition, which we'll talk about later on, to get rid of heretics. And he wasn't very talented with a lot of views, but he wanted to see the church do better things. He also did a really cool thing. He made a polyglot Bible. So basically on one page, he would have the Greek text of the Bible, the Hebrew text, and the Latin text, so you can compare them side by side, as a way to make sure that the church is getting the early writings correct through translation. You have Francois Rabelais, who's actually one of the more, I guess, controversial members this time. His books are banned for a long, long time. He was very secular this time, and really about human nature and echoed a lot of the Italian ideas. He basically wrote these fiction books that were once again satirical about life, about comedy and that kind of stuff of Gargantua and Pantagruel, stories about giants doing these cruel and gross and disgusting things, whether it be hedonistic or sexual, all kind of stuff. And most of them were banned because they were considered to be too racy for the time. But really talking about education and attacking the church and how they kind of did things and how rulers did things, telling us that we need more secular education, teach people how to live a good life, and that a lot of things that the church members were doing were not great things at this time. And once again, it's a very satirical thing, but it's kind of seen more for its shock value than anything. We have Michel de Montaigne, who wrote about what we call the modern day essay, right? He was a skeptic challenging things. So you kind of the first person you want to blame for about 5-paragraph essays, that's this guy here, right? About the idea of writing a thesis and then trying to back it up with knowledge and examples and thoughts and evidence. And so we say that, true knowledge might be able to obtain. We can't know everything. We have to be really cautious and be critical, but be tolerant. And kind of this first thought about, thinking about what's written out there and how things are and being able to question what's happening in the world today. And lastly, we have Shakespeare. Not lastly, but Shakespeare is considered a Renaissance writer as well, considered a Northern humanist. Many of his plays, his comedies, his dramas, his histories, his sonnets echo a lot of our Renaissance views. He has the histories of Rome with like Julius Caesar, and some of our plays that he writes. A lot about individualism, and a lot of his plays will have big ideas of individualism, people doing great things and making decisions, and humanism making great decisions when people try to do what they want to do. He also has a lot of like pagan rituals. So if you ever see Macbeth, the bubble, toil, and trouble, all that kind of stuff is in there. He questions monarchs like Richard III and Richard II and life on earth and all those kind of things. He kind of questions about love and beliefs and religion and a lot of cool things that way he actually questions. And as we look at his plays, not only as great literature and great theater, but also they have a lot of the humanist ideas embedded within them as well. And lastly, Miguel de Cervantes, the Don Quixote, which you may have seen in Spanish class, but questioning the old beliefs of a lot of people like chivalry and knights and idealism, all that kind of stuff. And these great men go off fighting the wars and all that, and the Crusades, all that kind of stuff, and basically making fun of these people that think they're so amazing because they are rich and nobles and all that kind of stuff. It makes them look ridiculous at going off and fighting windmills and whatnot. So, tons of information here, right? But our goal is going to be to think back to those original questions we have. What are the new thoughts that are being brought forward? How are they changing Europe? And top it off, how might people go against this idea? So if we're going to talk about, we get into class. I want to see you guys on that, okay? Thank you very much for your time and your attention. I really, really appreciate it. And we'll see you guys back in school. Thank you.